All right, hello everyone. It is Thursday, January 19th, and we are at the second half of week three. Hopefully, you've taken the opportunity to download your assignments from week three. Maybe check out the archive that was posted from Tuesday, where we went over a little bit of review, peer review for the previous week two assignments, and then got into the new week three Palace of Arinthalion game composition. I end up usually calling that the Palace composition. For your new round of assignments, you have a brand new composition with a new approach to how the music is built. And we talked mainly about the fact that you have a piece of music that is going to be multiple cues or multiple wave files playing at the same time, where you have basically one composition that is broken down into four parts or four stems, that each one of them contains at least 4 or 5 different instruments with excuse me, with similar instrumentation put together or combined to kind of fulfill the overall theme of that particular part of the game. Or if you've actually played the game, there are 4 different doorways that you would exit, and you can turn on and off the different pieces of music at the same time. And then we will, so we took a look at how it's all set up, the overall approach, and your other assignment that is for week three is a orchestral template. Is basically creating a session that will help you approach this larger, more complex type of composition. I definitely want to relay the idea that your instrumentation is limited for this composition. You are limited to acoustic and orchestral instrumentation. We're definitely trying to recreate the feel of the time period of the game. This is probably taking place in some sort of fantasy world in some far off time. And so orchestral slash acoustic instrumentation is the most appropriate to fulfill that overall idea and theme. So, this orchestral template that we'll talk about right now is going to help you build a session, a logic session, using contact instruments to. Oh, I lost my toolbar there. A logic session using contact instruments entirely comprised of brass strings, woodwinds, and no percussion, but we'll talk about how this is going to be set up. So, a template is going to hopefully make your life as a professional composer quite a bit easier, especially if you continually work on similar types of compositions. You work with the same client over and over again. You do an episodic series. You do the commercials or the radio or television commercials for a particular client that is effectively doing similar types of compositions. And you can approach these types of projects very straightforward with a template that gives you very quick access to a particular set of sounds. So if you are like me in most of your composition and your kind of your workflow overall, if you were to start out from scratch, you have a great idea for a hook or a melody. You want to get it into get it into some sort of form as quickly as possible. So you load up a blank Logic session and you create a couple of tracks. You set up instruments on those tracks. You set up maybe set up a drum machine, a couple of synthesizers. You add some plugins on top of that. Maybe you need to add a reverb, so you set up an aux send out to the reverb. You start going through a couple of different presets to load up the correct kind of sound that you're looking for. And maybe you have a microphone, you're recording an instrument, so you set up a microphone and an amp and a guitar, or you've got a vocal mic, or whatever it is. Anyway, setting up and getting started on a session can easily take 5, 10, 30 minutes of just getting everything up and ready from the point of time when you have the idea and you're ready to start working. So having a template allows you to get access to the sounds that you want in a very quick manner. The other thing is, when we started this assignment, one of the weaknesses of the compositions that were being submitted was individuals were not necessarily using the sounds or using the best sounds that they had access to. Whether it was the quality of sounds, maybe using the EXS24 library compared to a Contact library, or it was using an incorrect articulation, using a sustain articulation or a sustain violin on a more of a staccato line or on a faster part. They were using the incorrect type of sound, performance of the note, for the type of composition that they were playing. So it wasn't necessarily the notes themselves, but the performance or quality of the instrument. So this template will give you very quick access to a solid set of sounds, a palette of sounds that you can use in a very kind of efficient manner. So by the end of this session, well, I guess let me start here. When you download everything, you get a couple of PDFs. This first PDF kind of gives the overview that I'm giving right now, kind of tells you how to set everything up and turn it all in. The probably more useful to you, or definitely more useful, is the workflow PDF. And this is going to give you step-by-step instructions on how to set everything up, how to route things, how to organize this session in a way that's going to be most useful. So using that PDF is probably going to give you the best direction on how to approach this session. Hold on, let me pause just a moment. Okay, so the way that you approach this session is that you're eventually going to have a total of 56 tracks. What that breaks down to is it's actually 14 different instruments with 4 different articulations each. Most of the instruments have sustain, forte piano, sforzando, and staccato articulations. Down here in the strings, you get sustain, staccato, tremolo, and pizzicato. And let me just set up a group of these instruments. Once you set up a set of French horns or a set of clarinets or whatever, basically the building it in Contact and in Logic become very much the same from one to the next. So it really doesn't take that long to go through it once you kind of get the steps down. So I'm going to recreate these double bass down here. And when you do that, it asks or instructs that you start out by creating a couple of new tracks. We're going to create software instrument tracks, and we are going to create one track with 4 multi-timbral parts. And this is a key element of how things are going to be set up, because you can set up a lot of different tracks, and it actually doesn't route correctly when you get kind of deeper into the project. So we have one track with 4 multi-timbral parts. What that is going to allow us to do is route 4 MIDI channels into one instance of Contact. Let me show you the difference here. If I create this, notice that they all say instrument 14, and they are going to go to channel 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if I go to this first one, and set up a instance of contact. This one instance of contact loads up, or is accessible, is probably a better way of saying it, is accessible from all 4 of these MIDI channels. Even if I look at this and I click on the first one, it is set up to go to instrument 14, which is that instance of contact. It goes to MIDI channel 1, MIDI channel 2, MIDI channel 3, and MIDI channel 4. And what that allows me to do here on instrument 14 is I can load up 4 instances of that double bass, and you're going to use the Contact Factory library. Yours might look a little bit different. This is Complete 11, I think. Hey, where did I go? Oh, get hidden by Contact. Contact Factory library. I'm going to go in here, and just to show you where I'm at, I'm in the orchestral library, and I'm doing double bass, so I'm in the strings. And I'm going to, if you have a choice of solo and ensemble, most of this time ensemble will work best for you. It all depends really on the type of composition you're doing. But I'm going to throw 4 different double bass ensembles in there. 1 for each of those MIDI channels. Remember I said that each instrument has 4 different articulations. And we can quickly access those different articulations from 4 different instances of contact. Or no, sorry, 4 different instances of this double bass instrument. So the first one's going to be sustain. I'll even label it here. Sustain. It's going to be on MIDI channel 1, and it's going to go to the sustain articulation. This one's going to be named staccato. I'll just name them right now. This one's going to be tremolo. And this is going to be pizzicato. You should hopefully see what I'm doing here at this point where I set now. Where'd it go? I'll name this in a sec. MIDI channel 2 is going to go to the staccato articulation, so I'll choose staccato there. MIDI channel 3 is going to go to the tremolo articulation. It's on MIDI channel 3. And MIDI channel 4 is going to go to the pizzicato articulation. Now, I'll even name these over, well, I should name these. I'll name this double bass. I'll copy that name to make my life easier. The first one is double bass sustain. Excuse me. This is going to be double bass staccato. And this one's going to be double bass tremolo. And this one is going to be double bass staccato. Now, this becomes the most tedious part overall, is building all the tracks, setting them up and naming the tracks, routing them, setting up the articulation. But that is kind of the point of a template, is you set it all up once, and you don't have to set it up over and over and over again. You can always refer back to the template to have a good starting point. So I should be able to, let's see, let's probably, can I shrink this down anyway? No. Do this. Move these double basses up and throw these down here somehow. Well, if I arm my sustain articulation here, I'm cramped for space. Let's load up my keyboard. And I don't know if this will play, but I should be able to see meters, at least. No meters. Double bass, channel 1 goes in here. Oh, this is supposed to be sustain. Staccato, just double checking. Tremolo, yeah, that means I probably didn't set this one. No, I did. Oh, I know what I did. I went too far. I'm not in the right octave, probably. I need to be down lower, where the double bass is. There we go. Okay, so if I arm sustain, let's see, maybe I can do it this way. There we go. Now we can see some meters at the same time. Get myself in here somehow. Sustain, we've got those particular articulations. Is that playing? No. We don't need to hear it. Sustain, then I go to staccato, and you'll notice that my second MIDI channel plays. And then I go to tremolo, and my third MIDI channel plays. And then I go to pizzicato, and my fourth MIDI channel plays. The great thing is that you can arm them. It is immediately as you arm them, they play. You can also arm multiples at the same time and have multiple different articulations playing and give you combinations that way. So then you have, once these are set up, you have very quick access to do any one of these instruments. All you have to do, if you want a French horn staccato, then you just arm that and you start writing your lines like that. So that is the way that you will have these things set up, each one of your instruments set up. A couple of things I want to point out. One question is why, a question that often occurs is why have them on separate tracks when you have key switching? What's the difference between doing it this way and doing key switching? And the answer is really it's just a preference. Both of them are equally valid. Key switching is using an octave that will actually switch the articulation here. So here it's C5, since it's a double bass, it's so low, the octave's way higher. It's typically the red keys that you see down on your display down here, but I don't think I can shrink this down enough. I don't know what outputs do on my keyboard. Yeah, I can't get down there. It won't shrink for some reason. Here in the chat, I feel like sforzando, staccato, and pizzicato are the most realistic articulations. Having the correct mix of definitely staccato, pizzicato is very useful also, but having the correct mix between sustains, sforzando, forte, piano, you can work back and forth for those. Sustain does kind of get unnaturally sustained at some points, but it's really mostly about using the correct articulation at the correct time. Another common question here is, since I'm using 4 instances of this double bass, am I loading up 4 times this double bass samples? Am I using 4 times the amount of RAM? And notice up here, this is the overall amount of RAM that this instance of Contact is using, 44 megabytes. And each one of these individually loads up 44 megabytes. So what that says is it just loads up once, really, and uses, even though I have the different samples here, it doesn't load them up multiple times. It just references, if I choose tremolo in another one, or staccato in another one, it just uses those samples when needed. So it doesn't double up or quadruple the amount of sample usage by loading multiple instruments. Once you have all of the tracks set up, the mixer window has got a couple of things that you'll be doing. Notice, okay, piccolo, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, contrabassoon. Those are all of your woodwinds. So you got French horn, trumpet, trombone, tuba. Those are your brass, violin, viola, cello, and this is actually double bass. Notice here it is, the instrument 14. All 4 of these double basses, if I bring my keyboard back, all 4 of these double basses end up on one double bass channel. So even though it's multiple articulations, it really is just the same instrument. So it just pops up on one channel overall. That's another difference between using multi-timbral tracks. Let me just show you this. Just to show you the difference when you create these tracks, again, it's very important. You're going to do one track with 4 multi-timbral parts. When you do that, make a little bit room here. Notice it says instrument 15, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this would go to one instance of a synthesizer, whatever. It can go off to Massive or Reactor or Contact or any of any synth that accepts multiple MIDI inputs. I hope the ones I said actually do that. But it allows you to get 4 channels in, and it shows up as 1 channel in your mixer. Compare that against regular old tracks, right? If you were to create 4 new regular tracks, right? Just do 4 tracks. Notice this says instrument 16, 17, 18, 19. This is 4 different instances of, say, Contact that shows up on 4 different tracks in your mixer. So that's the difference between a normal track and a multi-timbral track, with 1 track with 4 parts. So you are using a multi-timbral track to allow you to work with Contact that way. Oh, whatever. Delete anyway. All of them. All of them. Go away. Okay, so back down here, everything shows up as an individual channel. Then what else? We have all of these, all of your woodwinds go to bus 1. And bus 1 is routed over here to a woodwind master. It goes through an EQ and it goes out. That's what you can mix all of the individual woodwinds, or you can mix everything as a group on a master. Then all of your brass, your French horns, your trumpets, your tubas, and your trombones, those all go to bus 2. Violins, violas, cellos, and now this double bass. This double bass needs to go to bus 3. Goes to a string master. Everything goes to bus 4, and that's a reverb. So we can add reverb to individual instruments, or we can add reverb to the global masters. Everything also gets compressor and EQ. And these are always blank, or at least they should start out blank. And you should also bypass them so they don't use anything until you need it. So again, the PDF here, goes through all the steps of creating a new session, creating your woodwinds, naming tracks, saving things, loading up Contact, creating a multi... Oh, I guess the other thing to show you is that at the end, when you save everything and you're going to deliver it onto FSO, I ask that you save all of the instances of Contact blank. They are turned off, and all of the plugins are turned off, so that it's a template. You want it to be able to load up as quickly as possible. And you don't necessarily need all 56 tracks until you need them. And it's going to just sit there in RAM and take up space and take up processing power. So when you get to the end, we want to save everything as a preset, and then we can always go back and load that preset up really quickly. So we're going to go here and save multi-as. A little bit of language here, a little bit of terminology. This whole thing, these 4 instruments together, are called a multi. It's called a multi-rack. It racks or has a rack of all the instruments that you use. Individual things here, like an individual double bass, is an instrument. A Contact instrument and a Contact multi. So we're going to save the combination of save a preset, which is the combination of these 4, and we're going to do save multi as. And you should probably put this back on your project file somewhere. But I named these orchestral double bass. Am I spelling it correct? There we go. Then I typically put an ENS because I think I did ensembles. Or I know I did ensembles. We only need the patch. You don't need to send me all the samples. I have all the samples. And then you save it. And at the end, you then do reset multi, and that'll clear everything out so that it isn't actually using RAM at that time. And then if you need it again, you could go to load or load recent, and all of that stuff should pop back in. Do you want to replace everything? Yes, we want to replace everything. And that double bass should pop right back up. So, presets. You're going to end up with 14 different presets, one for each of the instruments. Go ahead and I would suggest you set this up before you do the composition. That way you have a quality session to work from. All right, let me know if you have any questions as you are working on that assignment, if you run into any issues. All right, so we are going to get into our main topics for this afternoon. We are going to talk about what game music is doing for us in the game. What is its function? Some of the design ideas of how it actually performs in the game. And then we'll talk a bit we'll start getting into, not the technology or the software itself directly yet, but how the game, from the game's point of view, from the software, from the computer, that side of things, how does it know how to change and switch the music in real time? So when you worked on 2D Platformer, the first game of the month, the main idea that we're kind of focused on is the idea of intros, main loops, and endings, or a start, a loop, and a stop. And you had PDF documentation and the project itself that says, hey, deliver deliver 9 files. We're going to have 3 intros, 3 main loops, 3 endings. Name them this and place them in this folder, and the game is going to read those files, and next time you play the game, you'll hear your music. And we understand that from our point of view, mainly because the project says to do that. But how does the game know how does the game know that there's going to be an intro, a main loop, and an ending? How does it know that there are going to be 3 files that represent the intros, 3 main loops, and 3 endings? How does it know at the start of the game to play intro and play it one time until you go into the main loops? And play one intro once and then switch to main loops? How does it know that there are 3 main loops and they're going to randomize around? And whenever you choose one of them, how does it randomly choose one? How does it understand to play that? Gets to the end and then randomly choose another one and just keeps going. And how does it know to loop that or just keep choosing new ones? And then it gets to the ending and you lose all of your health points. How does it know that when you lose your health points that the game's over and to switch and play the correct files? And the real simple answer is it's in the code somewhere. It's a piece of software. Somebody somewhere programmed it to set it up so that when something happens in the game, it does something, right? I mean, that's what software does. We don't have to think very much about it, but when a piece of software runs on our computer, there is code somewhere in the background, and it is doing something. When we click buttons, we click the keyboard or click our mouse, code somewhere is doing something. So when I play the game and I hit the mouse button, it not only shoots the gun, but plays a gunshot sound. So, I mean, that's generally how it happens, but we're going to get into talking about, at least from the music point of view, how does the game know how to switch and change all of our music? So those are some of the concepts that we will get into, and then that will lead us into talking about the direct software applications. We'll get into that next week of what software is actually used to make all of this work. So hold on. Before we get into our brand new topic, let me take a quick pause. Let me know if you have any questions here. Okay. So we'll start out of what is the function of game music? What is it even doing there? Like, why do we have game music in our games? And what purpose is it serving the player? It's got to be there for something, and some of it's really obvious, and others are more specific to games. The first one we'll start out with should be pretty obvious, and this is often what is music doing in most places, right? What is music doing for us in general? Often it is there to convey emotion. One of the base effectiveness of our base effectiveness of our music is its emotional quality. So that should be quite obvious overall. Then you add it to picture, you add music to a movie, and music is there to provide the emotional undertone to everything. And it certainly crosses over into games, where sound effects in a game and a movie are there to tell the story. Dialogue is there to tell the story. Sound effects are there to give you information, and the music is there to tell you how to feel about everything. And you're really, one of your big and most challenging roles as a music composer is to follow the emotional ups and downs over the arc of the storyline. But getting into things that are more specific to games, of what it's actually there doing for you, music to help your state of mind, to get you into the game, to get you focused and connected directly to the game. This is the idea that through a lot of it's the same in a lot of genres of music, through strong repetition of a beat or a pattern or a rhythm. You can actually kind of get people emotionally or kind of focused either on a task or an emotion. So this is the idea of using the music to separate you from the fact that you are actually just sitting on your couch watching a TV or watching a screen, whether it is a 15-inch laptop screen or if it's a 70-inch major home theater big screen. It is really just kind of a window into the world, and even though you might have an awesome home theater surround sound system, or even if you're playing it on a small pair of earbuds, the music is there to kind of separate you from the outside world, the fact that you're just sitting there on a couch pushing buttons, and actually make you feel like you are the hero and the character in the story. I guess I should point out real quick, we'll get into a couple of these. Music as a state of mind. The next one here, music as a world builder. This one, or all of these. Music as these come from the textbook. You can find a lot of good, more kind of detailed information about the functions that all of these ideas or how music is actually supporting the gameplay. Music as a world builder. This is the idea that music can put you in a time or a place very, very quickly and simply, typically just from the first couple of notes of the soundtrack or the first kind of sound effects that you hear. A lot of games, a lot of movies and games will start at a black screen, and you will hear the beginning of your soundtrack, the beginning of sound effects, and will kind of transport you to that world very quickly. You know hopefully you can kind of tell where you are in the world, maybe what culture the setting is, where in history you might be, and music can place you there very quickly. This guy is wearing his HoloLens. This was a demonstration from E3. Not E3. Was it E3 this year? The HoloLens is Microsoft's augmented reality device. It's kind of not virtual reality, but kind of projects over the environment. And so music and sound effects are really interesting in the world of VR and AR, and it kind of puts you in that world even further. Music serving a pace in a game. How fast the game feels can often be driven by the music. You can change the pacing of the game just by changing the tempo, maybe using double time or half time. One of the better examples of this is the star in Mario, right? When you get the infinite power star or whatever it's called, the music speeds up. It goes and basically lets you know that you can start running very quickly and brings up the overall intensity of the game. If it's a racing game, oops, where do we go? The racing game here. A lot of information about the pace of your car, the speed that's traveling, the physics of it can be kind of inferred from the sound effects. So you'll hear the engine, you'll hear wind noise, you'll hear the tires on the ground, and turns and drifting and acceleration, and you're trying to almost recreate the feeling of it as much as you can through the power and the sound. Music as an audience. So it can take you to places, it can speed up and slow down the action in the game. Music as an audience refers to almost having a tutorial or using the music and sound as a tutorial to teach the player how they might play the game. A lot of games, if you do something good, you will hear a flurry of notes or a flourish that rises up and probably in a major key in an upward direction, and it sounds all positive and happy. If you do something bad, it will fall in a negative direction and go down maybe in a minor key, and maybe use dissonance and distortion, and there's all sorts of evil kind of ways we could make it sound. And very quickly, just through the reward of hearing that little piece of music, think about when you get all of the bricks all the way across in Tetris, or you playing Bejeweled or Candy Crush, or a lot of puzzle games use this very, very efficiently, where you can, a lot of those types of games are really simple to get into. A lot of people can play them, but they're really difficult to really master and can be played and enjoyed for a long period of time. So this goes all the way to the extreme of something like Guitar Hero. The newest Guitar Hero Live, I think it's called, actually has a audience in front of you cheering or booing you in your face to let you know that you aren't doing so well in the game. So it's direct feedback to the player and the gameplay. Music as branding. As all of these classic Nintendo games go by, you can probably maybe hum some of the musical themes from these games because of their kind of how they are tied to the game. Even separate from the game, they are identifiable, and understanding how your music is used outside of the game, how it's used for becoming memorable to the game experience, how it is tied in to the full game experience, and then how it is used to market and sell the game outside of playing the game itself. You want your music to be memorable. You want your music to be catchy and identifiable to a particular or the particular game that it's in. A lot of these games, right? These classic games, we got Super Mario Brothers, we got Metroid, Pokemon, Kirby, and Zelda. Legend of Zelda. These games kind of benefited from their limited technology. It was very repetitive. There's like 3.5 minutes of music in all of the original Super Mario Brothers, and you probably played it for hours and hours and hours at one point. So it repeats over and over and over again. There are games, early arcade games, had an attract mode where their job was to be loud and obnoxious to attract your attention over so that you would play the video game. So how does your music work now in more modern situations? It's how is it used in advertising, in the marketing of the game, in like downloadable content and extensions of the game, sequels to the game, understanding how your music is used beyond just being in the game itself. And it's kind of how identifiable and memorable it is to the project. Music as demarcation. Um, Music can often be used to tell you where you are in the game, what level you are on, or are you in the safe town, or are you in the dangerous dungeon in the game. Music in a game is mostly there for the player. Very rarely do the characters actually hear the music. It's kind of like a movie. Most of the time, the movie soundtrack is for the audience. Rarely do the characters actually hear the music that's playing in the movie. Maybe it is heard through a radio. Maybe they go into a club or something like that, and they would hear music, or it's playing through some speaker somewhere in the game world. The car radios from Grand Theft Auto are probably one of the better examples of this, where it's mostly the music soundtrack for the game, but it's actually playing in the game world. You hear it from passing cars as they go by. The idea of diegetic and non-diegetic music. These are terms mostly from film, or I guess they originated in the film world, but can certainly be applied to games. Whether diegetic music actually exists in the game world, or non-diegetic music exists only for the player to hear. And then getting into virtual reality games, right? With the PlayStation VR is out and quite popular, the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive. The games industry would love for virtual reality to really take off on a consumer level, so that people have to buy all new gear and games, and it's a whole new way to play the game. And as somebody who absolutely loves games, it is very, very impressive, the virtual reality technology. It is pretty much cost prohibitive right now for most humans, but it'll be interesting to see if it's the way it goes. And in games, the traditional way of playing games is kind of same way you watch a movie. You are sitting and watching a screen, and you are watching a character go through their adventure, and you at sometimes in your mind you kind of feel like you're the character, especially in the game when you actually have direct control of the character. You kind of you have that connection overall. But in virtual reality games, you are the character. You're not just sitting on the couch watching somebody else do it. You supposedly are that character. And if it is mimicking a real world experience, then we don't have music that follows us everywhere. Unfortunately, we are not all Darth Vader that has the Imperial March following us everywhere we go. But that might be cool in a virtual reality game. The great part about it is nobody really knows, and everybody's figuring it out as they go. Gives a lot of opportunity. So understanding where the music exists in the game. Does it exist actually in the game world? Does it exist lots of different locations in the world may have their own piece of music. So when determining how much music is needed for the game, it's often you like count all the different locations. Maybe every room you go into in the game doesn't need a sound or a piece of music, but large sections you can get overall themes for what you need. And finally, music creates immersion. It's that idea of you actually being the character, you being able to believe the game world. A lot of times a game sounds quite empty when it's just sound effects and ambiences. Same thing with a movie. If you've ever had the chance, maybe in behind the scenes or something, to watch some clip of a movie without the soundtrack to it, it sounds kind of not fake. I mean, sometimes it is. If you're really paying attention to the audio, you can hear a lot of cuts, and honestly, music hides a lot in the soundtrack of a movie and a game. So music is there to really help draw you into the experience. Just for the fact that you have sound playing through your speakers, it kind of separates you from the sounds in the surrounding rooms, and it really helps to draw you into that world. So these are really a lot of the some of the base functions that are discussed in your text, and gives us some of the realities of, or some of the specifics for games, like some of the unique elements that might be present in a movie, but things like the immersion factor and location of where you are in the game, and your your ability to interact with the world and have actually control over the story presents a lot of unique characteristics for a game. All right, limited resources. Let's. It's all fun and games until we actually realize how much space we have available on a game disk or on the processor, how much RAM you have available. And honestly, this is getting a whole lot better. It's not as much of a concern as it has been in previous generations of gaming consoles. But if you do music for a mobile game or some other, like a website or something, this reality is still very present. But the reality is you don't have unlimited resources. When you're working in your DAW, there's only so many instances of a synthesizer or like Space Designer Reverb that you can load up. There's only so many of them that you can have playing, so many tracks that you can have playing simultaneously. It all depends on the processor speed in your computer, how much RAM you have, and all of these things can limit how much stuff is playing back simultaneously. In music, it doesn't matter how many tracks you have in your DAW session, because at the end of the day, the consumer or the listener only listens to a stereo mix. The listener has no idea that you had 250 tracks in your session. In a game, however, if you have 250 tracks playing simultaneously, that can, with effects and automation and all of that, can affect the playback of the game, how smooth it runs, how fast everything runs. So there are limitations, and these are some of them. Limited RAM. How much RAM do you have in your computer? How much RAM do you have in your game system? The answer is 8 gigabytes of RAM. More than likely, if you have an Xbox One or a PlayStation 4, both of those have 8 gigabytes of RAM. Your computer, you might have, hopefully you don't have 4 gigs. Hopefully, maybe you don't even have 8 gigs. Maybe you have 16 gigs of RAM. Maybe you even upped it up to 32 gigs of RAM. The amount of RAM that you have is the amount of libraries or amount of samples you can load up. We often deal with sample libraries of strings and brass, and we only can load up so many of those samples before we run out of RAM. Same thing goes with a game. If you want a sound to be available immediately to play as soon as the player hits the button, a gunshot or a punch or a jump or a door opening or something to deal with animation, that sound needs to be available immediately. It needs to be loaded up into RAM. And there's only a limited amount of RAM that you have available. From the PlayStation 3, you had 512 megabytes. To the PlayStation 4, you had 8 gigabytes. So that's 16 times the amount of RAM going from PlayStation 3 to PlayStation 4. It got a whole lot better. But we'll just fill it up again. The industry just makes bigger and bigger games. So this is how much how many sounds you can have immediately available. It's a constant battle between size and quality, right? So if you want more files, they typically have to be less quality so that you can fit them into the same amount of space. Memory footprint. This is how much RAM you have access to at any one point. This is often, if your game is divided into levels, then you'll have different amount of RAM for each level. Level 1 will load up. You'll load up all the sounds that you need for level 1. Then it'll go to level 2. It'll unload everything out of level 1 and go to level 2. It's like unloading one Logic session and going into another Logic session. A lot of games, when they don't do it as much anymore, but whenever you see a loading screen, sometimes a game would just stop for a little while and load up the next part of it. That is loading up graphics and sounds and everything into RAM. The disk space. We can't load up everything all the time, so some of it has to be stored on the disk somewhere. Games are still distributed on discs, DVD discs, or Blu-ray. Mostly the new Xbox and the PlayStation all run on Blu-ray. that gives upwards of 50 gigabytes worth of space. Um, it's hilarious because you go back to the original Nintendo games, classic games. Um, they had around only a couple of hundred kilobytes available. The cartridge itself could hold up to a megabyte, and the some of the last Nintendo games were holding like a megabyte. Some of the last Nintendo 64 games were holding like four 4 megabytes, or maybe 64 megabytes, somewhere like it's either 4, 16, or 64. Pretty small overall. I love the fact that this picture of Mario and Duck Hunt is bigger than the actual games themselves. This picture is probably 100 kilobytes, and Mario and Duck Hunt was less than 100 kilobytes. So you'd be hard pressed to like. That's why there were no samples. I mean, everything was synthesized in real time for the sounds. Then we went to CDs, 650 megabytes. Then we went to DVDs, about 4.9 gigabytes. Now we're at Blu-ray discs that are about 50 gigabytes. And that doesn't even matter anymore because now you download games and they're like 60 or 70 gigabytes. I think I downloaded the new Doom game recently and it was like 70 gigabytes on my hard drive. Quite large overall. So they'll just get bigger and bigger. It doesn't matter as much. I mean, now that we have like terabyte hard drives, it's not as much of an issue. But you go back to doing a game on a phone, and that phone needs to be 100 megabytes to download, gives you some limitations. Then you have limited audio systems. Not only is it just technical, it's a reality of what speakers are they playing it back on. You would hope that everybody listens to your music in your game on an amazing home theater surround sound system. But more than likely, a large portion of your audience is not going to listen to the music on a better system than you have in your studio, which is probably good because you want to monitor it in the highest quality kind of setting. But the reality is people are going to be listening on their cheap included computer speakers or headphones, which may not be all that bad, or their mono speaker on their TV, or earbuds, or the little speaker out of their phone. So maybe if you're doing an iOS game or an Android game, you don't put a whole bunch of bass in the music because it's just going to play out of little tiny phone speakers. So, limitations, just considerations on how things are playing back. Know your audience. Know how things are going to be listened and monitored. The cool thing is that games do all of these. Like a high-end game on a PlayStation or Xbox One can actually switch and change between stereo and 5.1 mixes. It can actually change the compression ratios and the overall dynamic range of the music and the sound. So it makes for some interesting mixing challenges. All right, so for our last topic here, we wanted to talk about some of the elements of building your music for the game. How does the game actually know how to use the music that you feed it? And we'll talk about the different components of a music system, like what does the game use to build our soundtrack, and then we'll get into a couple of approaches for a couple of different approaches for the music system and how it plays back your music. So let me take another quick pause here before we get into our topic. Okay, so the basic building blocks of our music for our game. We've probably already noticed that a very integral part of all of this is your linear loop, or just a loop, a music loop. A loop allows us to musically sit in one spot, waiting for something to happen before we move on to the next thing. We basically use loops and what are known as one-shots. And one-shots are just a file that plays once. There's no looping. Like most sound effects, most pieces of music, it just plays and stops at the end. But a loop allows us to go around and around in the same piece of music and sitting there in one place waiting for the player to perform a particular action or to find the next doorway or move on to the next part of the story. So your loops, you often want to get your player lost in those loops. You don't want them to realize that they're stuck in a loop. You want to, typically looping music needs to underscore the action and activity in the game, but not really present any strong signposts that say, hey, look, here we go around again, where the loop might occur. So, another thing is I don't want you to leave the class thinking that games are made up of a whole bunch of 8 and 16 bar loops. Just for the fact that our games are smaller experiences overall means that we don't have really big, long loops. The fact that our demos really last about a minute or two, we want to switch through as much stuff and show off as much change as possible. So, but most games that are hours and hours worth of content and experience, their looping music is a series of long loops that are minutes long. I mean, they can easily be shorter loops that are stringed together, but most of the time it's made up in longer sequences that allow you to explore different key changes and tempo changes and move and change your instrumentation with enough time to return back. So the real key here is that whatever you do over the course of the loop, whatever changes happen, it always returns back by the end of the file so that it can loop back around and makes sense. Often used during periods of long exploration, level loops, puzzle solving. When you give the action over to the player and you don't know how long it's going to take them to complete that action, often a loop can help. But sometimes if it loops around long enough, you don't want it to loop again. Here we go, in the third time around, the fourth time around. Maybe by that fifth time around, we don't want to play that piece of music again. We don't want it to annoy the player. So a lot of games have a board switch, which says, okay, the music's about to get boring. Here on the fifth time we're going to play it, we're just going to fade it out to silence. And then you'll hear, not silence, you'll hear ambiences, footsteps, the sound effects in the game, but no soundtrack. Because they're still wandering around, still lost, trying to figure it out. But when they turn that corner, they find the next part of the story, they find the next enemy, boom, the music swells back in like it was meant to be there, and we continue on. So it is a question of how you want to prevent it from being as loopy and as annoying as possible, as repetitive as possible, and there's all sorts of ways of creating a loop to reduce the repetitiveness. If it's done through your composition, like if you know that you are composing a loop, then you can hide the fact that it's a loop a whole lot easier. You can just compose your way around that so that you can explore off into any direction and hide the loop point by reducing any sort of attention that is drawn to it. Your choice of instrumentation, faster, more staccato instruments make for easier loops. The drums make for easier loops because they have a sharp, fast attack and then they fade out. Low, sustained bass from a bass synthesizer, or if it's a cello or a double bass or anything that produces a bass guitar, longer waveform overall, those become a lot more difficult to loop. Things like choirs, where they're wide frequency range, lots of low end, high end, sustained parts, makes for much more difficult loops. It's possible, but a little bit more care is taken. You can use fades, meaning that the action, whatever action fades in, I got to get out of the way before it fades off to nothing. You shouldn't put actual fades to silence because there'll be music, 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 and then it'll go to silent, and then music will come back. But fades is you have lower intensity instrumentation. The intensity rises and then it fades back down, or you can fade off into weird effects and textures and pads and then move on to the next thing. Rhythm, like I said, drums, rhythmic passages become more or easier to loop overall than sustained pads. Blasting everything out into a whole bunch of effects. Sometimes, like a DJ who's trying to get from a record at 1 BPM to another BPM, they'll just hit it out into a whole bunch of reverb and delays and swishing weird sounds, and then so get one rhythm out of the way and kind of lose the listener and then move on to the next thing. And then just basic editing. We saw a couple of different editing techniques. A lot of times music is written as a linear piece of music that is not meant to loop. And then you have to edit your way through that piece of music to find parts that do loop. A lot of composers are just composers for games, and then somebody else actually conforms all the music to loop and work in the game. So you might be editing pieces of music that weren't initially meant to loop and trying to find points that do. Like I said, the opposite of a loop is a one-shot. It just plays one time. And a type of one-shot is a stinger. All stingers are one-shots, but not all one-shots are stingers. Meaning that a stinger is there to imply emphasis or embellishment to an action. Meaning here you have your adventurer, they're walking through the temple, and you have exploration music all the way through, and then they find a power-up or they find a secret, and you have a found it stinger. So it's a little couple of notes, harp notes or some sort of effect that every time they find that secret or they find the pickup, they hear that particular little, typically really quick sound. Can either be music, can be sound design. Another approach to this is think about spooky voices in a haunted house. You could go into a vocal booth and record 10 spooky voices and then loop them in the game, but it's the same exact 10 voices in the same order looping around and around. Or you could chop them up into 10 individual spooky voice files and put them into the game and have the game randomly play them. They can also position them randomly in the game world so that it's a haunted house and you hear it from all different directions. It can randomize pitch and timing so that they play at different intervals, and it gives you a lot more variation to the sound. So whether it's a music stinger, whether it's a sound effects stinger, there for emphasis or embellishment, as I mentioned, it's there to point a finger at that action and say, hey, this thing happened, and here's a little bit of sound to tell you that it's probably good or bad. It's there to hide a musical transition. We did this in Angry Bots, where to go from ambient to action, the stinger plays at the same time and at the same moment that it transitions from one to the next to hopefully add some randomization and hide that crossover. Or at least attract attention away from it. Puzzles, power-ups, secrets, environments, common places where a stinger would be found, or a one-shot. You solve a puzzle, you hear a stinger. You get a power-up or a secret, you hear a stinger. Or if it's a particular environmental effect, like the haunted house, will provide you a bit of variation. Game states. This next concept is the main thing that drives the changes in your music. When we talk about how does the game know when the game starts to play intro, then once the intro is finished to play main loop, and once you've lost all of your health points to play ending. And the answer to that is game states. The changes in the game state from one thing to the next will drive changes in our music. So I have a very bad definition for game states. My English teacher always told me, you do not define the word. You do not use the word you are trying to define in the definition, right? So here's my very bad definition of game states. It is the state the game is in at any one time. What is a game state? It is the state of the game. So it is what is happening at any one moment in time. If you could freeze time, you could actually identify something has happened and play a piece of music according to that. And this happens at what is known as every frame of the game. Every moment that it draws something up on the screen, it calculates everything that's involved with drawing that image on the screen. Meaning, I'm playing a game, I'm playing a first-person shooter game, playing like Call of Duty or Battlefield or something like that. And the game will draw an image on the screen at a particular frame rate. Hopefully you have discussed frame rates in a separate class, probably a post-production class at some point, where you talked about maybe the frame rate of television or the frame rate of film. There's a different standard for European television and American standard. The basic frame rate of black and white television is 30 frames per second. Once we got to color TV, it went to 29.97 for a wonderfully complicated reason. But let's just use nice big round numbers, 30 frames per second. So drawing something at 30 frames per second on the screen is what we consider kind of smooth animation or smooth movement enough that we perceive it as realistic movement. Games try to get even faster than that, so they look even cooler and it is even better to play at a very fast pace. Games like the PlayStation, games on the PlayStation, and I think the Xbox does this, goes up to 60 frames per second. So it gives a much more kind of realistic feel. And this is 60 times per second, it draws something on the screen. And the more powerful the computer, the faster it can draw it on the screen. The higher quality the graphics, the more power it has to take to render all that. That's why you need a fast gaming console. You need a fast computer with a fast video card and lots of processing power and RAM and all those fun things to make your games look amazing on the screen. So let's take 60 frames per second. 60 times per second it draws something on the screen. And in between those frames, 1/60th of a second, it has to basically calculate everything through the game that is necessary. Did you move forward? Did you take a step forward? Did you shoot at something? Did something shoot at you? Did you hit something? Did you cause damage? How much damage did you cause? Did you cause enough damage that it went down to 0? And basically the game, 60 times per second, is asking a whole bunch of different questions. And the computer is constantly answering them. What has happened? Did this happen? Did the game start? Did the game end? And let's figure out how all of this works so I can figure out what to draw on the screen and the player can continue to play the game. It couldn't figure out it any faster than it draws on the screen. I mean, it could. It's a computer. But that's not fair because it can't figure out if you shot somebody and you hit them and caused damage before you can actually see it. So games in general will run at 60 frames per second, 30 frames per second. If it's a really slow game, like you have a really slow computer, it can get down to like 15 frames per second and 10 frames per second and looks real jitters around, looks like it stutters. So the frame rate, very important. Frame rate is how fast it can draw it on the screen. So 60 times per second, the game is figuring out everything that it needs to determine. So let's use that talking about 2D platformer and how the music works. Because you could even say that 60 times per second, the computer is determining the state of the game. It's determining its game states. And if those game states change, you get more health, you get less health, you get a high score, you get a low score, the time runs out, or basically anything that is possible in the game. You, at 60 frames per second, you can ask the computer and say, hey, did this thing happen? And if it did, then let's change our music. So 2D platformer. Game starts. And the game says, okay, game is start. What do I do? And the computer looks at the code. Or actually, let's do it the other way. Computer says, what do I do? And the game looks at the code and says, okay, it says here that when the game starts, you need to play one of these 3 intro files. There's going to be 3 intro files. They're named exactly this, and they're going to be in this folder. And as long as you as the composer did your job, meaning that you generated 3 files of music and you named them exactly as to what the computer expects and in a particular folder, then the game says, okay, randomly choose one of those and play it. And so the computer randomly picks a number out of the hat. It knows there's 3 of them and randomly plays it. And then 60 times per second, the game looks at the code and says, okay, is it done? Is that done? Is that file done playing? 60 times per second, it says, is that still playing? And the computer says, yes, that WAV file is still playing. And now your intro cue is I don't know, 10 seconds long or something like that. And so 60 times per second, it's asking, is it done? Is it done? Is it done? And the computer is constantly going, no, 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 it's not done, until that file ends. And all of a sudden the game says, is that file done? And the computer says, yes, actually now that file has stopped playing. What do I do now? And the game looks at the code and says, well, it says once this intro is done, then there should be 3 main loop files. They're going to be named exactly this, and they're going to be put in this folder, and randomly choose one of them and play it. And the computer says, okay, goes looks for the file. It's there. It starts playing it. And the game says 60 times per second, is that main loop done? No, no, no. Is it over yet? No, no, no. Until that main loop file, main loop 3, is done playing. And the game says, is it done yet? The computer says, yes. Okay, main loop 1 is done. What do I do now? And the computer looks back at, or the game looks back at the code and says, okay, now randomly choose another one and play the next one. And it does that over and over again, 60 times per second. Is it done playing? No, it's not. Oh, yes, now it is done playing. Okay, randomly choose another one. Now, while all of that is going on, it's asking another question. And it says, hey, have I lost all my health points yet? Is the main character, have they been killed? Is their health at 0? And the game, for most of the gameplay, while you are playing the game, it says no. No, they still have 100% health. No, they're at 50% health. Oh, they're at 10% health. Well, okay, let me know when they're at 0. And it constantly asks, is it there? Is it there? Is it 0, 0, 0? Finally, you take that last bit of damage, and the game says, okay, is that, are we at 0 now? And the computer says, oh, yes, right in that last frame, the character lost all their health points, and we're at 0 now. What do I do? And the game says, okay, look at the code and says, when the health reaches 0, stop playing the main loop, and here's 3 endings, randomly choose one of them and play it. And the computer goes and does that, plays the ending, stops the main loops, plays the ending, and we hear the ending file until it gets to the end. And at some point the game says, okay, are we done? Are we done playing that? Computer says yes, and we say, okay, let's restart everything, and we'll start all over again. Game starts, plays intros. Once you finish intros, plays main loops. Once you lose all your health points, plays the ending. So a game state is really that question. A game state isn't really anything. It's not a concrete thing. It's not part of the game, part of the code. It's really just an idea that says, if this thing is happening, then do this over here. That is very, very common in code and computers in general. It's called the if-then statement. If this thing happens, then go do this thing over here. If my health reaches 0, then play ending. If the game starts, then play intro. If intro is done, then play main loop. If main loop is done, then randomly choose another main loop. So at 60 times per second, the game is asking those questions, and the computer is answering those questions, and it allows us to when the answer changes, it allows us to change our music. These end up becoming, we call these hooks or triggers. If this thing happens, then trigger this piece of music to play. If this thing happens, let me hook into that idea and I'll play this piece of music. It's really the changes that happen to your music, because in between that, while the file is playing, the game isn't really doing all that much with your music, or the computer isn't really doing all that much. It's just playing it. It's just spitting out the ones and zeros that has already been recorded and composed, and just plays the file. But the real interesting changes in the interactivity of your music comes in the changes in the game. And as the game changes, then you can hook different parts of the music together. So a game state is a concept. It's an idea. And these are very, very popular game states. Your score. Did you get the highest score? Did you get the lowest score? Did your score change? Then we will play particular music. You get in first place, we're going to play first place music. You lose, we're going to play lose music. Are you at 100% health? Are you at 0 health? Are you at 10% health? Did you get a power up? Did you get more health or less health? Whatever. We can change the music according to all that. The time left, right? Super Mario Brothers. You get less than 100 seconds left, the music starts going da 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 da. It speeds up. So the timer changed. We can attach a piece of music to that. It's really, a game state can be anything that you want it to be. Can be any idea that you can come up with. And a lot of times it starts out with the phrase, wouldn't it be really cool if we did this in the game? Man, when I enter this area, I want this monster's going to jump out. I want monster reveal music. And then I'm going to battle the monster, so I want battle music. And then I'm going to win or lose, and I want win and lose music. Can we do that? And so you're the composer. You've got this great idea. You've got awesome music that goes along with it. You can't go into the game and program everything. So these game states allows us to set up a condition to say, okay, I'm going to go write some awesome battle music. And I don't have to know anything about the code or the game or how all that tech works. All I know is if I go make these pieces of music and I name them this and I format it this way and I put it in this folder, it's going to work. And then the programmers, the game developers, your clients, they don't have to know anything about the music. I mean, they know if they like it or not and how cool it is, but they don't have to know anything about making music, music theory, music production. That's the stuff that they hired you for. But they know that there's going to be these 5 files there. And when they're going to go into the game somewhere magically in their code. And when that monster jumps out, it's going to play that one file. And when you battle the monster, then it's going to play this other file. And that just all ties into the changes in the game states. So we can use those to build a particular type of music system. And we're going to talk about 2 approaches. Basically horizontal music system and a vertical music system, sometimes known as horizontal resequencing and vertical layering. I often think that these are terms that music composers have had to make up when describing what they're actually doing behind the scenes. This stuff has existed for a very long time in games, but hasn't really had much terminology or certainly books written about it. Which is why our textbook is so great for all this stuff. It actually mentions from a composer's point of view how this all works as opposed to a programming point of view. But it's basically the way that we've been using our music in our games, in our projects, and just in the industry as a whole. This is a pretty common approach. So starting out with horizontal approach to your music. And before I explain this, let me go into my DAW just to give you an example of this and give you some sort of visual representation of what I'm talking about. Let me kind of shrink this down here. Okay. When I talk about a horizontal music system or a vertical music system, well, now I'm talking about a horizontal music system. When I talk about a horizontal music system, I suggest you think about a single stereo track in your DAW. So on this track, I'm going to get my pencil tool out here. On this track, you can have multiple different regions or multiple different wave files, right? So let's say this is verse and chorus and bridges and outros or whatever. And I'll even make this a little prettier and say this one's going to be red, and this one's going to be blue, and this one's going to be purple, and this one's going to be green. So these, maybe this is a baseline, and this is the baseline. You recorded 4 different audio files. So these 4 regions represent 4 different audio files. Why didn't that go? 4 different pieces of music. And so as you play through on a track in your DAW, it plays one file when it's in that region, and it plays another file when it's in this one, and each one stops the previous one and the next one plays. You only hear one at a time. You have one stereo track. You only have one track to play a particular sound, and so you only hear one at a time. First one starts playing. When it ends, stops playing. The next one starts playing, stops playing, and so on. I mean, granted, you can have gaps between them. But the main concepts here are you only hear one sound or one wave file at a time, and then these could be rearranged in any sort of order that you wanted to create the mix that you need. So the same thing kind of translates over into a horizontal music system. These are individual sections of music that can be shuffled in different orders. 2D Platformer and Angry Bots are set up this way, where your 2D Platformer, you only ever hear intro or main loop or ending, and it's just one of them at any time. Always the previous one turns off and the next one starts. They can either turn off in sync, like the only reason that your intros and main loops work is because you composed them that way, so that you knew that when it would play the intro file, go all the way to the end, and the next one starts playing. So we kept it in the same key, in the same tempo, so that would make logical sense. But with the endings, you have no clue when they're going to play. And so it's just going to hard cut your main loop off and go immediately into the ending. Same sort of thing here. These different colors represent different game states. They also represent different wave files. So this could be a game where starts out with the intro piece of music, goes immediately into an action loop, plays that constantly during gameplay. You find a power-up for the next 30 seconds. You're in berserk mode, and so you play 30 seconds worth of berserk music. That power-up ends, that piece of music ends, and you go back into action. Action plays, then you get to low health. Maybe you get less than 10% health. So you hear low health music, you find more health, goes back up, you go back to action, then all of a sudden you lose all your health points, and you hear the death cue. So only one of these is playing at a time, and they can be shuffled around in any sort of order. Since they're shuffled around, it probably makes sense that you put them all in the same key at the same tempo so that they can rearrange in any sort of order to make sense. You don't always have to do it that way, but that's probably the best way to start, and then you can find different combinations that can still work together. This is the way that it has been done since the dawn of games. Well, I guess since it was sampled audio. Maybe with synthesizers, a little bit different approach because it's not WAV files. But this was the way it was done with a WAV file where for earlier games where you could only play one WAV file at a time. They couldn't keep multiple files in sync and play them together. There were limits of how many sounds you could play at the same time, so there was often that was given up to sound effects, and music was just one voice or one channel at a time. I mean, stereo, so I guess 2 channels. This was the way it was done. You could only play one file at a time, so it would just switch to the correct one at any time, and most of the time it was pretty invisible, so it just felt like one piece of music. This horizontal approach to your music is better if you know what the player is going to do in any situation, meaning that they have to go through a logical progression of events to move through the game. It works for an action game because it's a pretty straightforward progression. You're going to fight, 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 and then you might pick up a power up or you might win or lose, but it's a little bit more direct approach. Puzzle games, casual games, kids games, where they're actually just kind of simpler games overall, often are just better served by a simpler musical approach. So these are multiple themes. They're fully mixed. That's something else, is that since you only hear one at a time, that means each wave file needs to have drums, bass, harmony, and melody. It's not like you are individually separating out the different instruments. You only hear one at a time, so each new theme replaces whatever you were hearing before. So this is a horizontal setup, meaning that this kind of horizontal layout of your music. You only hear one at a time, and then they can be shuffled around in any sort of order so that they still make sense when playing back. Let me take another quick pause before we get into our vertical approach here. Okay, so to compare this vertical approach against the horizontal approach that we were talking about, now instead of thinking about one single track in your DAW, think about a multi-track DAW session, where instead of them playing back to back, they're actually layered and playing together at the same time. This is what they mean by a vertically layered system, where they're kind of stacked up on top of each other, and they are playing a loop together. The best way of approaching this typically is having them all start at the same time. They all end at the same time. They're going to be in the same key and the same tempo and time signature so that they stay in sync all the way through. And this is how our Week 3 Palace of Orinthalion composition is set up, where you might have earth, wind, fire, and water, and they are set up to be able to play together. So with this approach, it really becomes one ongoing piece of music. It's like one big loop, right? Obviously, this is really short right now, but right, this would end up being probably minutes long, and these layers could fade in and fade out at any time. So what the game now does is the game has some way of mixing the levels, changing the volume, and bringing them up and down. So at different parts in the game, certain elements fade in. You hear a new musical element of the composition, and then they fade back out again. But they do have the possibility, they still make sense when playing together simultaneously. There's a great video in the suggested viewing for Red Dead Redemption, which is a great game. They're coming out with a second one. We're all looking forward to that. And they use this sort of vertical music system by creating all of their music in stems. And those stems, basically they told all of the artists to play at 130 BPM in A minor. And that allowed them to combine performances from lots of different artists and mix and match them according to the action that's happening on screen. This introduces new elements to match the player's actions. This allows you to introduce a new idea whenever you want. When using a horizontal music system, where you can only hear one thing at a time, you have to wait for changes in the music to occur. If you want to keep everything in sync and make it feel like one continuous piece of music, then that means you have to wait for the next beat or the next bar or the next 2 bars or 4 bars to make some sort of logical transition from one piece of music to the next. Or you can just hard cut it, but that often messes up with the rhythmic aspects of the music. Now, 2D platformer gets away with it because it's kind of more of a simple approach, and you just died and you just end the game right there. So that makes sense, the music hard cuts. But for most of a continuous gameplay or action, you don't want these sudden stutters and stops and starts in the music. So that means you have to wait till the next bar or the next 4 bars or 8 bars to make some sort of logical transition. You have to wait. But with this, in a vertical music system, as the music is playing, you could just fade it in, a new idea, fade it in and fade it out whenever you need it. So this gives you the ability you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait to introduce a new idea. The action happens. You can bring in that sound as needed. So here we have different layers of instruments. We have different game states down here: ambient, proximity, close, action, break, action, cooldown. So things build up. They might break back down. More layers come back in the mix and come back out of the mix. It allows you to build and recede the music over time. Each new layer is faded in on top of the others. Often used in open world games. If you have less of an idea of what's about to happen in the game, where you don't know when things are going to happen, you don't know in what order they might happen, then a vertical music system is a better way of going. And often more advanced games, newer games overall, use this kind of vertically layered approach. Works very well in open world fantasy games and horror games also. We have ambient, proximity, close, action, and cooldown. Basically, the layers of instruments build and build from ambient up to action. That's when the peak of the battle happens with the enemy. And then if you win or lose, it cools down and it returns back through the different layers. So this is vertically layering, allows you to rise and fall. The music allows to rise and fall with the action and intensity. It doesn't matter when that monster jumps out, but as soon as they do, we have a new piece of music that's constantly been playing in the background. You just couldn't hear it. And then the monster jumps out and you hear that new piece of layer of the music. One ongoing loop. Each loop must move used with other layers. Same key, same tempo. Basically referred to all of that. There are 2 different ways and 2 different approaches to a vertical music system. Additive layering and not interpolation, interchange. That's what I was looking for. Additive layering means with each new instrument layer, with each new cue, you add on to the previous layers. Basically, you start the game and you only hear ambient. And then the monster's generally out there and you hear ambient and proximity. And then the monster's right around the corner and you hear ambient, proximity, and close. And then the action breaks out and you hear ambient, proximity, close, and action. And each one adds a new layer of intensity to the always building music. And then when you're done, it goes from action back to close, back to proximity, back to ambient, builds up and falls back down. So the good thing here is you always have the previous cues to rely on. You always know the ambient's going to be there. The drawback is you only have one way in and one way out. It's kind of one combination in and out of the music. Interchange doesn't rely on the previous pieces of music. It's not going to go ambient, proximity, close, action, action, close, proximity, ambient. This is the way the Palace of Orinthalion works. You have no clue, earth, wind, fire, and water, which combination and what order they're going to use. So interchange will give you the most combinations because you could have ambient, proximity, close, action, action, proximity, ambient, just whatever. What is it? n factorial different combinations of music cues in there. So lots of possibilities, but you're never guaranteed another piece of music is going to be there. So you have to make sure that each one of them has enough content on its own. That's why we couldn't put like percussion in just the earth cue and then have it still be there when we get all the other cues in there, because we're not always sure that a particular file is going to be playing. So as I talked quite a bit in our last session, I definitely suggest for this kind of vertical approach for this larger orchestral session to use a top-down approach, meaning that don't worry about these individual layers. Don't think about it as trying to write 5 different parts and combine them all together. Think about the composition first. Think about the notes that all of them are going to follow, the general progression and a melody or an overall theme for each one of them, and then separate it out into the instrumentation. Once you have the notes, then you basically figure out what what instrument voices are going to play what notes, and you can start figuring out the combinations from there. So, a couple of different ideas of the music and how the music is actually working in the game. We saw the different functions of music, how it's serving our game, and then we talked about the individual building blocks of a music system, whether it's a one-shot piece of music, whether it's a looping piece of music, and then we talked about a couple of different. We talked about game states. It's probably one of the more important concepts of this is driving the changes in the game. The game states basically can happen up to 60 times per second, and it can drive and inform the music as to when to change. Then we saw horizontal and vertical music systems, where different approaches to how the music might work. The real answer is that games rarely just use one. Different parts of a game, depending on the action that's going on, they often switch back and forth. If you know, hey, this is a pre-sequenced series of events, characters are going to have to go into this room and switch this button and then go fight these sets of bad guys and then enter this jumping puzzle and then go fight the bad guy. If it's a logical sequence, then maybe a horizontal music system works. If you're leaving them out in the open countryside and they're just wandering from event to event, then maybe a vertical music system where it's a little bit more open-ended and random might account for that. So let's go ahead and round it up there. If you have any questions, let me know. You can post those up in the chat. Stick around for a few minutes afterwards. If you have any questions on the template or the game composition or any of those elements, let me know. And other than that, we'll see you again on Tuesday after you submit the Palace of Renthalion, and we'll do a bit of peer review then. So thanks a lot. Have a good evening.